November 1941, Sidi Rezegh, a South African battery is cut off. German panzers are closing in from the south, and the west, and the east. In any other war, in any other century, this battery is dead. Their guns are pointing the wrong way. To turn a standard field gun 90 degrees to face a flanking tank takes minutes they don't have. But these men are manning the Ordnance QF 25-pounder. And underneath its wheels sits a strange, circular steel track that the Germans didn't bother to invent. In seconds, the entire battery swings 180 degrees. They don't just survive, they destroy 72 tanks. On paper, the German 105mm LeFH-18 was the superior weapon. Bigger shell, more range. But paper doesn't fight in the desert. Today, we aren't looking at spreadsheets. We are looking at the engineering duel between the two workhorses of World War II, the British 25-pounder and the German LeFH-18. Which one actually won the war?
When I first joined the army in 2001, I was trained by the artillery regiment, and I've been in the artillery regiment nearly 9 years now. I'm qualified in the 25-pounder, the 105mm, both the L118 and L119. The 120 mortar and the 81. I'm the number one on the gun. I make sure that the ammunition goes in, the correct ammunition charges go into the gun, that the correct data is applied onto the sights. Basically, I'm in charge of the gun overall. Worked on a 25-pounder for 9 years, like I said. Fired on numerous occasions down in the Glen, and I enjoyed firing up when I was in service, and today was a good day, and it's a pity to see it going. So it's a good weapon, and it's been around a long time.
Before we go any further, I want to address something. Because every time a video like this goes up, the comments fill up within the first hour, and they all say the same thing. The German gun was bigger. Bigger is better. End of discussion. And I understand that instinct. I really do. The LeFH-18 fired a 105mm shell. The 25-pounder fired an 87.6mm shell. On a spec sheet, on a wall chart, on a pub argument, the German gun wins every time. But here is what those people are missing. Artillery doesn't win battles by being impressive on a wall chart. It wins battles by putting steel on target faster than the other side can recover. And when we get into the firing test data later in this video, you are going to see exactly why a lighter, smaller shell, fired with greater precision, at a higher rate, and from a platform that could swing to face any direction, killed significantly more infantry per engagement than its heavier German counterpart. That data is coming. Stick with us. Right, let's get the numbers on the table, and then we can get into the engineering that actually matters. Think of this as top trumps. 2 cards. 2 guns. Let's read them out. In the German corner, the Leichte Feldhaubitze 18, the LeFH-18. Light Field Howitzer, 1930s German engineering. Caliber, 105mm. Shell weight, 14.8 kilograms. Maximum range, 10,675 meters. Weight in action, approximately 1,985 kilograms. Rate of fire, around 4 rounds per minute at best. It entered service in 1935 and became the backbone of German divisional artillery throughout the entire war. Call it what it is, the heavyweight boxer, powerful, deliberate, built to hit hard. In the British corner, the Ordnance QF 25-pounder, caliber, 87.6mm, shell weight, 11.3 kilograms, maximum range, 12,250 meters. And notice that number, because we will come back to it. Weight in action, approximately 1,800 kilograms. Rate of fire, 5 rounds per minute sustained, with trained crews hitting bursts of 8. It entered service in 1940 and served in every theater the British Army fought in. North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, Burma, Korea, and beyond. Call it the middleweight with reach, lighter on its feet, and with a longer arm than the man trying to knock it out. Now, those are the numbers, and if that's all you wanted, you could have found them on Wikipedia in about 45 seconds. What you're here for is the engineering beneath those numbers, the decisions that German and British designers made in the 1930s that determined which crews lived and which crews died in the Western Desert a decade later. Let's start with the Germans. The LeFH-18 is, by any honest measure, a beautifully engineered weapon. The Germans in the interwar period were thinking seriously about artillery. They had studied the lessons of the First World War with characteristic thoroughness, and what they concluded was that their divisional artillery needed to hit harder. The French 75s, the British 18-pounder. These were guns designed to fire flat trajectories at targets you could more or less see. The Germans wanted something that could arc shells over ridge lines, drop rounds into reverse slopes, and crack field fortifications. They wanted a howitzer, and the LeFH-18 delivered that. The carriage design they chose was the split trail, two long steel legs that spread apart behind the gun when it goes into action. This is a logical, proven design. When those trails are spread and dug in, the gun is enormously stable. You can fire at high charges without the carriage walking backwards. The recoil forces are distributed efficiently. The breech mechanism is robust and reliable. German manufacturing quality in this period was exceptional, and every component of the LeFH-18 reflects that. But the split trail has a problem, a fundamental geometric problem that no amount of engineering excellence can solve. When those two trail legs are spread out behind the gun, they occupy a very specific patch of ground. The left trail goes one direction, the right trail goes another, and between them, there is a hard physical limit to how far you can swing the barrel left or right before one of those trails hits the earth and stops you. On the LeFH-18, that limit is 60 degrees of traverse, 30 degrees left of center, 30 degrees right of center. That is your world. That is the cone within which you can engage targets without touching the trails. 60 degrees sounds like quite a lot. In a set-piece battle, with a defined front line, with targets appearing more or less where you expect them, 60 degrees is plenty. You point the gun at the enemy, you dig in the trails, and you fire. That is what the Germans designed the LeFH-18 to do. But what happens when a target appears outside that 60-degree cone? What happens when a tank appears at your 4 o'clock? You have to move the gun. The crew must lift the trails, physically manhandle a 2-ton weapon, swing it around, redig the spades, relay the gun, and only then can they fire. In a training environment, on hard, flat ground, with a fresh and well-drilled crew, this takes somewhere between 60 and 90 seconds. In combat, under fire, on broken ground, it takes longer. In Russian mud, it sometimes barely happened at all. In the open desert of North Africa, where the battle moved at the speed of tanks and flanking attacks could appear from directions no one expected, that 60-degree traverse limitation was not a minor inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Now here is where the story turns. Because the British designers looked at exactly the same problem and arrived at a completely different solution. In the late 1930s, the team at the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich was developing what would become the 25-pounder, and they understood something critical. The next war was not going to be the last war. The Western Front of 1914 to 1918 was defined by fixed positions, known frontages, and predictable enemy locations. The next war, everyone could see it coming, was going to be a war of movement, of mechanized forces, of fluid fronts where the enemy could appear from directions that made no tactical sense whatsoever. And so they asked themselves a question. How do you give a field gun 360 degrees of traverse without making it impossibly complicated or slow to deploy? The answer was the firing platform, a circular steel disc, roughly the size of a large wagon wheel, fitted with a central pivot and a set of ramps. When the 25-pounder went into action, the crew drove the gun forward so that the wheels rode up onto the platform. The platform sat flat on the ground. The wheels of the gun now rested on a curved steel track built into the outer ring of that disc, and the entire weight of the gun, all 1,800 kilograms of it, was now balanced on that central pivot. This is it, the piece of steel that changed the war. It looks almost absurdly simple, like something you might find on a fairground ride rather than a piece of frontline military hardware. But watch what it does. A single gunner, one man, can grab the trail of the 25-pounder and walk it around the platform. The wheels roll smoothly on the curved track. The pivot takes the weight. A 1.6-ton weapon moves like a compass needle, full 360-degree traverse, in seconds, without digging, without shifting trails, without any of the heavy, exhausting manual labor that the LeFH-18 crew faced every time the tactical situation changed. And in the desert, the tactical situation changed constantly. Think about what this meant in practice. A 25-pounder battery could be laid facing east at dawn, engaging German armor moving up from that direction. By mid-morning, a flanking column appears from the north. The crews don't abandon their positions. They don't dig up trail spades and manhandle their guns through 90 degrees of agonizing physical work. They grab the trails, walk around the platform, and they are on target again. The entire battery can reorient in the time it took a LeFH-18 crew to move their trails by 30 degrees. The 25-pounder was not just a field gun. In the desert, with no fixed front line, with enemy armor appearing from any point of the compass at any hour, it was the world's largest rapid response weapon. Now, I want to talk about something that rarely gets covered in the standard comparison videos, and I think it explains a great deal about why British artillery in this period performed as well as it did. The ammunition system. Both guns fired separate loading ammunition. That is, the shell and the propellant charge were loaded independently, rather than as a single fixed round. This was standard practice for howitzers of this era, and it allowed the crew to adjust the range and trajectory by selecting different charge loads. Standard enough. But the 25-pounder took this concept further than the LeFH-18 in a way that gave British gunners a genuinely significant tactical advantage. The 25-pounder used a variable charge system with 3 standard increments, charge 1, charge 2, and charge 3, plus a supercharge for maximum range. These weren't simply different amounts of the same propellant stuffed into a bag. They were carefully engineered ballistic packages that gave the gun genuinely different performance characteristics depending on what the tactical situation demanded.
Load powder! Ready to fire! Fire! Fire!
On charge 1, the 25-pounder could loft its shell at very high angles, dropping rounds nearly vertically into dead ground, behind ridges, into wadis, into the reverse slopes of desert escarpments where tanks and infantry sheltered from flat trajectory fire. On supercharge, it could reach out to 12,250 meters and strike targets beyond the effective range of the LeFH-18 entirely. But perhaps more importantly, the variable charge system, combined with the 25-pounder's good elevation range, gave British gunners extraordinary flexibility in the type of fire mission they could execute from a single gun position without moving. The same gun that was dropping near vertical plunging fire onto infantry sheltering in a wadi in the morning could, by afternoon, be firing on a flatter trajectory at longer range to engage a forming up area 6 miles away. The LeFH-18 was also a capable howitzer with its own charge options, and I don't want to overstate this point. But the British system, paired with the 25-pounder's firing platform and the centralized fire control doctrine that Montgomery would later exploit so effectively, created an artillery capability that was genuinely greater than the sum of its parts. And then there is the rate of fire. The 25-pounder could sustain 5 rounds per minute with a well-drilled crew. Trained crews, in combat conditions, have been documented hitting bursts of 8 rounds per minute over short periods. The LeFH-18, heavier to handle, with a more physically demanding loading procedure, managed approximately 4 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. In the heat, the dust, and the physical exhaustion of sustained desert fighting, that gap widened. Over the course of a fire mission, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, the accumulated difference in rounds on target between a battery of 25-pounders and a battery of LeFH-18s was not trivial. It was the difference between suppression and annihilation, between breaking up an attack and merely slowing it down. By October 1942, Bernard Montgomery had assembled the largest concentration of British artillery since the First World War. At El Alamein, he had access to approximately 900 guns of various types, and at the heart of that force were hundreds of 25-pounders. And he was about to use them in a way that demonstrated everything we have just been discussing about what made the 25-pounder superior, not as individual weapons, but as a system. The German and Italian approach to artillery in North Africa was broadly similar to their approach elsewhere. Batteries were assigned to support specific infantry or armored formations. They moved with those formations, fired in support of their immediate tactical objectives, and operated with a degree of independence at battery and regimental level. The LeFH-18 was, in many respects, designed for exactly this kind of decentralized combined arms operation. A lone wolf, as we said, powerful on its own, capable and self-contained. Montgomery did something fundamentally different. He centralized control of his artillery at the corps and army level to a degree that the Germans found genuinely difficult to counter. Rather than parceling out his 25-pounders to support individual brigades, he retained the ability to concentrate mass fires from hundreds of guns simultaneously against a single point in the enemy line. The famous creeping barrage that opened the Battle of El Alamein on the night of 23 October 1942 involved over 900 guns, firing in carefully coordinated lifts, moving a wall of steel across the Axis positions at a walking pace ahead of the advancing infantry. This doctrine, the concentration of artillery mass, was not new. The British had developed it painfully and expensively on the Somme and at Passchendaele. But it required a gun that could be deployed quickly, reoriented rapidly as the battle developed, and sustained at a high rate of fire across extended periods. It required, in other words, exactly the characteristics that the 25-pounder's firing platform, variable charge system, and rate of fire provided. The LeFH-18 was not well suited to this kind of centralized mass fire doctrine. Its slower rate of fire, its traverse limitation, and the physical demands it placed on its crew made it harder to sustain the intensity and flexibility that coordinated mass artillery required. The Germans were not unaware of this. Throughout the North African campaign, German artillery commanders repeatedly reported the British superiority in coordinated fire support and the speed with which British guns could shift fires from one target to another. The 25-pounder was a pack animal. One gun was capable. A regiment of them was formidable. 400 of them, all talking to the same forward observation officer, all responding to the same fire control system. That was something that altered the strategic balance of the entire campaign. Here is the uncomfortable truth about the British Army in 1941. Their tanks were not good enough. The Matilda was well armored but slow. The Crusader, and we will come back to the Crusader in a future episode, because that vehicle deserves its own forensic examination, was fast but mechanically catastrophic. The 2-pounder gun that equipped most British tanks in this period could, under the right conditions, penetrate German armor. But the Panzer IV, with its long 75mm gun and increasingly the up-armored variants of German tanks arriving in theater, were proving resistant to the 2-pounder at any practical combat range. The British anti-tank gun situation was, to use a technical term, desperate. And so, as has happened throughout military history, when the designated solution to a problem proves inadequate, the men on the ground improvised. The 25-pounder was pressed into service as the primary anti-tank weapon of the 8th Army, not occasionally, not as a last resort, but routinely as a matter of doctrine. Now, the 25-pounder was not designed as an anti-tank gun. It did not have the long, high-velocity barrel of a dedicated anti-tank weapon, but it had two things that mattered enormously in this role. It had a solid, armor-piercing shot, a simple, dense steel projectile without a bursting charge, that when fired on supercharge, could penetrate approximately 70 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. Against the Panzer III and the earlier Panzer IV variants, this was lethal. Against heavier tanks, it was at least capable of damaging running gear, optics, and external equipment, and of forcing tank commanders to button up and reduce their situational awareness. But the really critical factor was the firing platform. When a Panzer closed to within a kilometer of a 25-pounder battery, it was not approaching from a direction that the gun crew had necessarily anticipated. Tanks flanked, tanks probed, tanks moved at speed and changed axis. A gun that could only traverse 60 degrees was constantly at risk of being caught with a tank outside its engagement cone. A gun on a circular firing platform could track a moving tank continuously, swinging to follow it the way a man follows a moving target with a rifle, smoothly and without interruption. Crews would lower the trail of the 25-pounder, engage direct fire over open sights, and track moving armor across the desert floor with the same fluid motion that made the platform so valuable in the indirect fire role. There are accounts of individual 25-pounder detachments engaging and destroying multiple tanks in a single action, not because the gun was extraordinarily powerful, but because it could keep its barrel on a moving target when every other gun in the theater was struggling to keep up. The LeFH-18 crews were not cowards, and they were not unskilled. They were fighting with a weapon that, when confronted with a fast-moving tank at an unexpected bearing, required them to perform minutes of heavy manual work before they could fire. In the Western Desert, minutes were not available. Seconds were barely available. This was not a flaw in German bravery or German training. It was a flaw in German engineering philosophy. They had built a magnificent siege weapon and sent it to fight a cavalryman's war. We talk about guns as though they are autonomous machines. We quote muzzle velocities and shell weights and traverse arcs as though the steel itself is what matters. But every artillery piece in history is only as effective as the men serving it, and the men serving it are only as effective as the weapon allows them to be. Let's talk about what it was actually like to crew these guns. The LeFH-18 was a heavy, demanding weapon. Moving it into position required either a vehicle tow, which in the desert was frequently interrupted by terrain, enemy action, and mechanical breakdown, or a substantial crew effort on foot. The split trails, once opened, had to be dug in with spades to prevent the gun from moving under recoil. In hard desert ground, this was merely hard work. In Russian mud, it was sometimes barely achievable. In an emergency, when you needed to move quickly and the ground was not cooperating, the LeFH-18 was a liability. German gun crews throughout the war acknowledged the physical brutality of serving the LeFH-18 in difficult conditions. It was not that the gun was poorly designed. It was not. It was that its design assumed a set of operational conditions that the war, stubbornly, refused to provide. And there is another problem that the LeFH-18 crews lived with every single day on the Eastern Front and in North Africa: the gun shield. The LeFH-18 had a reasonable gun shield, a curved steel plate that protected the crew from shell fragments and small arms fire from the front. But the gun was large, it was heavy, it was difficult to conceal in open terrain, and its distinctive silhouette, once identified, attracted counter-battery fire. The 25-pounder, by contrast, was compact and, for a field gun, relatively easy to camouflage. It sat lower to the ground, its profile was smaller, and the gun shield, while modest, was designed thoughtfully to protect the crew across a wide arc, given the gun's 360-degree capability. But perhaps the most significant difference in crew experience was something far simpler than any of this. It was the speed at which the 25-pounder could go from traveling to firing. A trained 25-pounder detachment could be in action, gun deployed on platform, laid on a target, ready to fire, in under 2 minutes. In an emergency, faster than that. The platform dropped, the wheels rode up, the trail came around, the gun was loaded. That was it. No digging, no heavy trail manipulation, no waiting. That speed saved lives. Not just the lives of the gunners, who could get into action and get their gun firing before enemy counter-battery fire found their position, but the lives of the infantry and the tank crews who were screaming for fire support and getting it in time to matter. And the Germans knew it. The 25-pounder earned a nickname from the German and Italian troops on the receiving end of it. They called it the Ratsch-Bum. Ratsch, the sound of the shell arriving. Bum, the explosion. In German, these words run together because the gun's muzzle velocity was high enough that in many engagements the shell arrived before the sound of the firing. There was almost no warning. One moment the desert was quiet, the next, the world ended. If the enemy names your weapon, you have made an impression. History is the longest performance review in existence. And when we step back from the heat and the dust of the Western Desert and look at what happened to these two guns after 1945, the verdict is unambiguous. The LeFH-18 ended with the Third Reich. By May 1945, German manufacturing had collapsed, German supply lines had ceased to function, and the guns that remained were either captured or destroyed. A small number were used by post-war armed forces of other nations in the immediate aftermath of the conflict, but the LeFH-18 as a weapon system was finished. It disappeared from frontline service almost entirely within a decade of the war's end. The 25-pounder served until the 1970s in British service. That is not a misprint. More than 3 decades of frontline use after the end of the Second World War. It fought in Korea. It fought in the Suez Crisis. It was used in Malaya, in Cyprus, in the Borneo confrontation, in Aden. It equipped the artillery of newly independent Commonwealth nations and remained in their inventories for years beyond that. India used it, Australia used it, Canada used it, Pakistan used it. Some nations were still operating it into the 1980s. Why does a weapon last that long? It lasts that long because it works, because it is reliable, because it is adaptable, because the fundamental design decisions made at the Royal Arsenal in the late 1930s were so sound that no replacement was needed for a generation. You can argue about muzzle velocity and shell weight all day long, but longevity is the argument that cannot be refuted. A weapon that fights in 5 different wars on 4 different continents across 35 years is not a stopgap. It is not an adequate interim solution. It is a genuinely excellent piece of engineering. The LeFH-18 was a product of its time and its doctrine. It served the Wehrmacht's purposes within the operational framework for which it was designed. But when that framework was shattered by the realities of modern, fluid, multi-directional warfare, the gun had no answer. The 25-pounder had answers for everything. So let's bring this home. The German LeFH-18 was a magnificent siege weapon, beautifully engineered, robust, hard-hitting. If you are fighting a war where the front line is fixed, where your targets are known, where you have time to dig in your trails and methodically range your guns, take the German weapon. Take it without hesitation. It will do exactly what you need it to do. But the Second World War was not that war. The Second World War was a race. It was a war of movement, of fluid fronts, of tank attacks from directions no one anticipated, of infantry that needed fire support in minutes rather than hours, of battery positions that had to be established, abandoned, and re-established across terrain that changed daily. It was a war that punished anything that was slow, anything that was inflexible, anything that demanded predictable conditions in order to perform. The British 25-pounder was built for exactly that war. It was lighter. It was faster into action. It fired more rounds per minute. It outranged its German counterpart. And most critically of all, thanks to that simple, almost laughably simple circular firing platform, it could fight in any direction, at any moment, against any target, without the crew performing a minute of heavy manual labor first. It was the right gun, at the right time, in the right hands, and the desert proved it. So the 25-pounder wins the field gun war. The engineering verdict is clear. The tactical evidence is overwhelming, and the longevity of the design speaks for itself in a way that statistics simply cannot. But the 25-pounder didn't fight alone. It was protecting tanks, and those tanks, in 1941 and 1942, were fighting a very different kind of war, a desperate kind of war, a war where British engineers were making decisions every bit as consequential as the ones we have been examining today, and getting some of them spectacularly wrong. Next week, we are going to open up the archives on the Crusader tank, a vehicle that was so fast it could outrun the enemy, and so mechanically unreliable it couldn't always outrun itself. A tank that jumped over trenches and broke down in the desert at a rate that would make a modern mechanic weep. And when we get to the engine cooling system, and we will get to the engine cooling system, you are going to understand exactly how a nation that produced the 25-pounder also managed to produce something quite that catastrophically misconceived. Subscribe now so you don't miss that one. It is a disaster you genuinely